Taekwondo story, Korean teenager bullied, inspiring short film, true story adaptation, black belt fight, bullying awareness, emotional student story, high school drama, courage and strength, underdog wins, powerful storytelling, martial arts motivation, self-defense story, Ethan Park, Olivia Vance, resilience, anti-bullying campaign. Maple Creek. Sounds nice, doesn't it? Like something off a postcard. Tree-lined streets, tidy lawns, the kind of place where everyone supposedly knows everyone. And maybe they do. But knowing of someone and actually seeing them, well, that's different. Northwood High sat squat in the middle of it all, a sprawling brick building buzzing with the usual teenage energy, hormones, homework, and the complex, unspoken hierarchy that governs these places. It felt like a different planet to Ethan Park. Not just because it was America and everything smelled different, looked different, sounded different from the bustling streets of Seoul he'd left behind, but because he felt fundamentally out of sync. Like a radio tuned to the wrong frequency. His wish, walking through those imposing front doors for the first time, wasn't fame or popularity. God, no. It was simpler. More desperate. He just wanted to be invisible. A ghost in the machine. Fade into the lockers, blend into the crowded hallways, be just another face nobody bothered to remember. He was Ethan Park, 17, armed with a scholarship that felt more like a brand than an opportunity, and carrying the weight of expectations he wasn't sure he could meet. He kept his head down, his worn hoodie pulled up slightly, clutching the strap of his backpack like a lifeline. His clothes weren't designer. His shoes had seen better days. Small details, maybe, but in the sharp-eyed ecosystem of Northwood High, they were signals. Flags marking him as other. He tried. Really, he did. Found his locker, navigated the maze-like corridors, slipped into classrooms just before the bell. He'd sit in the back, focus on the teacher, on the textbook, on anything but the curious glances that sometimes flickered his way before inevitably sliding off. They'd see the unfamiliar face, the quiet demeanor, maybe note the slight accent if he ever had to speak, and file him away under irrelevant. Which was, ironically, exactly what he wanted. Or so he told himself. But invisibility came with a different kind of weight, the suffocating pressure of loneliness. The constant, low hum of not belonging. And then there was Jake Miller. You couldn't miss Jake. Even if you tried. He moved through the halls like he owned them, flanked by his usual crew, guys with easy laughs and expensive sneakers who orbited him like satellites. Jake was Northwood royalty. Captain of something important, probably football or basketball, Ethan hadn't bothered to find out. He had that effortless confidence born of privilege, a smirk that could curdle milk, and eyes that seemed to assess everyone for their worthiness in his world. Most bowed, metaphorically speaking. Got out of his way. Laughed a little too loud at his jokes. Ethan first registered on Jake's radar during lunch on the third day. It wasn't dramatic. Nothing overt. Ethan had found a vacant table in the far corner of the deafening cafeteria, trying to make himself small as he ate the lunch his mother had packed. He felt eyes on him and looked up, just for a second. Jake Miller was standing a few tables away, surrounded by his court. He wasn't looking directly at Ethan, but he'd nudged one of his friends, tilted his head slightly in Ethan's direction, and said something Ethan couldn't hear over the din. But the dismissive curl of Jake's lip, the soft snickers from his friends. Ethan didn't need to hear the words. The message was clear. Look at the charity case. Doesn't belong. Ethan dropped his gaze back to his food, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He focused on his breathing, a technique learned long ago in a very different setting. Inhale peace, exhale noise. Or something like that. It was harder to do here. The noise wasn't just sound, it was judgment, exclusion, the constant reminder of his otherness. He felt a flicker of something hot beneath his practiced calm, something sharp and unwelcome. He pushed it down. Control. That was the key. Control was everything. His hands, resting on the table, looked deceptively slender, but there was a certain tension in them, a coiled readiness that hinted at something more than the quiet, slightly built immigrant kid persona he projected. A hidden strength, buried deep. For now. He finished his lunch quickly, the food tasting like cardboard, and escaped the cafeteria's chaos. But the feeling lingered. Jake Miller hadn't really done anything. Not yet. It was just a look, a probable comment. Small stuff. But Ethan knew, with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in his gut, that it was just the beginning. His wish for invisibility? Increasingly unlikely. Especially when you caught the eye of the king. As he navigated the afternoon classes, a ghost trying desperately not to be seen, he couldn't shake the image of Jake's smirk, or the feeling of being targeted. He found himself scanning the hallways, a low-level alertness humming beneath his skin. Fitting in wasn't going to be simple, was it? Perhaps impossible. He caught Jake's eye again across a crowded corridor just before the final bell, a brief, challenging stare that held no warmth, only a promise of future scrutiny. Ethan looked away first, melting back into the crowd, but the interaction felt like a seal hardening. His quiet existence here was already under threat. But the hallways of Northwood High couldn't know the whole story, they couldn't guess the discipline forged elsewhere, far away from here. But the hallways of Northwood High couldn't know the whole story, they couldn't guess the discipline forged elsewhere, far away from the casual cruelty and careless judgment. That challenging stare from Jake Miller might promise trouble, but Ethan Park had faced different kinds of challenges before. Challenges that required more than just enduring. While school felt like a minefield he had to navigate with painstaking care, there was another place, tucked away on the less glamorous side of Maple Creek, where the rules were different. Clearer. More demanding, perhaps, but infinitely more honest. Phoenix Taekwondo Academy wasn't much to look at from the outside. It shared a tired-looking building with a tire shop, the bold red letters of its name slightly faded above a plain glass door. No gleaming chrome or fancy reception area here. Just the unmistakable, pungent scent of sweat, worn leather padding, and floor cleaner that hit you the moment you stepped inside. It smelled like effort. Like discipline. A world away from the cloying perfume and simmering tension of Northwood. Here, the soundtrack wasn't gossip and laughter, but the rhythmic thud of kicks hitting pads, the sharp kayak shouts echoing off the walls, and the steady, focused breathing of students moving through their forms. Daniel Park, Ethan's older brother, stood near the center of the worn blue mats, observing a beginner's class. Daniel was only a few years older than Ethan, but he carried himself with an air of quiet authority that belied his age. Responsibility did that to a person, Ethan supposed. Daniel was the Sabamnim, the instructor, the one keeping their father's legacy, and their family, afloat. His face, so similar to Ethan's, was etched with a seriousness that rarely softened, except when his gaze fell on his younger brother slipping through the door. A brief nod passed between them, an entire conversation contained in that single gesture, "You're here. Good. Leave the outside world outside." Ethan bowed towards the flags hanging on the far wall, American and Korean, a ritual of respect ingrained since childhood. He shed his worn hoodie and jeans, exchanging the anonymous shield of his school attire for the crisp white dobok. Tying the black belt around his waist felt like buckling armor. Not the kind that deflected blows, but the kind that centered the mind. Here, he wasn't the scholarship kid, the quiet immigrant. He was Ethan Park, first-degree black belt. A student of Taekwondo. His father's son. The change was immediate. Standing barefoot on the familiar, slightly yielding mats, his posture straightened. The hesitant slump disappeared, replaced by a quiet readiness. He began his warm-ups, the movements flowing with a grace and precision that seemed almost impossible given his unassuming build at school. Each stretch, each block, each turn was exact, honed by years of relentless practice. This wasn't just exercise, it was a language he understood, a meditation in motion. He moved onto his forms, the intricate sequences of blocks, strikes, and kicks performed against an imaginary opponent. The Pumsi. His movements were sharp, fluid, powerful yet controlled. There was a snap to his techniques, a contained energy that vibrated just beneath the surface. Watching him, you wouldn't see the boy who kept his head down in math class. You'd see a discipline, a focus, that was almost intimidating. But as he moved through the familiar patterns, the peace he sought here warred with the ugliness of the school day. Jake Miller's sneering face superimposed itself over his imaginary opponent. The whispers, scholarship student, charity case, echoed louder than Daniel's commands. His father's voice surfaced in his memory, calm and steady as it had been in their small dojo back in Busan, years ago, before everything changed. Taekwondo, Ethan, is not about learning to fight. It's about learning not to fight. About finding the strength to walk away. The truest victory is the one achieved without conflict. Easy for you to say, Appa, Ethan thought, bitterness a sharp taste in his mouth as he executed a sharp sidekick. You didn't have to deal with Jake Miller. You didn't see the look in his eyes. The thought was disloyal, and he pushed it away, focusing harder on his technique, channeling the frustration into the controlled snap of his fist. But the conflict remained, a knot tightening in his stomach. How could he reconcile his father's philosophy of peace and restraint with the visceral urge to wipe that smirk off Jake's face? To show them, just once, that he wasn't the easy target they thought he was? He remembered the hushed conversations after the accident, the grim-faced men who came knocking, demanding money the family didn't have. He remembered Daniel, barely out of his teens, selling off their father's treasured possessions, promising their tearful mother they'd start again, somewhere new. Daniel had sacrificed his own dreams to build this small dojo from nothing, working nights driving deliveries to pay the rent, pouring every spare cent and ounce of energy into keeping the Phoenix Academy alive. Their mother worked herself to exhaustion cleaning offices late into the night. Also, Ethan could have this chance, this scholarship, this daily dose of humiliation? Patience, his father had preached. Endurance. That was true strength. But how much could one person endure before patience felt exactly like weakness? Focus, Ethan. Daniel's sharp command cut through his thoughts. He'd faltered, his concentration broken. Daniel walked over, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp. Your mind is at school, not here. Leave it there. On this mat, there is only the movement. Ethan nodded, taking a deep breath, shame heating his face. He refocused, pouring everything into the remaining forms, the physical exertion a welcome release. Sweat beaded on his forehead, stinging his eyes, but his movements became sharper again, more centered. By the time the session ended, his muscles ached with a satisfying fatigue, his breathing deep and even. Daniel handed him a water bottle, their shared silence comfortable for a moment. Hard day? Daniel finally asked, his voice softer now. Ethan just shrugged, taking a long drink. Saying it out loud, the taunts, the stares, Jake's calculated dismissal, felt like giving it too much power. Daniel seemed to understand anyway. He clapped a firm hand on Ethan's shoulder. Remember what Appa taught us. Strength isn't loud. It endures. You endure. He paused, his gaze holding Ethan's. But endurance doesn't mean being a punching bag either. Know the difference. Ethan nodded again, the familiar weight of his father's philosophy settling back onto him, a shield and a burden all at once. He felt calmer, grounded by the familiar rituals of the dojo, the sweat, the discipline, his brother's steady presence. This place, this sanctuary built on sacrifice and echoing with his father's principles, was where he could breathe, where he could remember who he truly was beneath the mask of invisibility he wore at school. Still, as he changed back into his street clothes, the fragile peace felt temporary. The insults and judgments of Northwood High waited just outside the door, a stark contrast to the respect and discipline within these walls. The lessons learned here on the mat felt a world away from the battles fought in those unforgiving hallways, and he had a sinking feeling that the next test was coming soon. That fragile peace Ethan found within the dojo walls, the grounding calm achieved through sweat and discipline, always felt paper-thin the moment he stepped back into the fluorescent-lit jungle of Northwood High. His brother Daniel's words about endurance echoed, but the daily reality was a relentless test of that very principle. The lessons learned on the mat seemed like a foreign language here, one nobody else spoke or respected. And the tests kept coming, growing bolder, sharper, as if sensing the tightly coiled control Ethan fought so hard to maintain. It wasn't just Jake Miller anymore, though Jake was usually the conductor of the orchestra of casual cruelty. His lieutenants, Mark and Sean, thick-necked guys who seemed permanently attached to Jake's elbows, took their cues with gleeful enthusiasm. One day in the cafeteria, Mark would accidentally stumble against Ethan's table, sending his tray clattering, a shower of rice and kimchi skittering across the floor. The ensuing laughter from their table felt like tiny daggers. "Whoa, sorry man," Mark would say, dripping in sincerity. "Guess that, homemade stuff, is kinda slippery." More laughter. Ethan would just quietly gather the mess, his face an unreadable mask, ignoring the stares, ignoring the way the word homemade was spat out like an insult. Another time, it would be Sean in the crowded hallway between classes, a deliberate shoulder check that sent Ethan's books flying. "Watch it, scholarship," Sean would sneer, not even bothering to lower his voice. The whispers followed him then, louder now, less covert. "Charity case. Doesn't he know this isn't some ESL class? My dad says his family probably lives in that dumpy apartment complex by the highway." Each word was a pinprick, testing his resolve. He'd gather his books, his knuckles white where he gripped the covers, take a slow, measured breath, inhale peace, exhale noise, and keep walking. But the effort was immense. It was a constant, exhausting performance of calm, a dam holding back a flood of frustration that simmered dangerously close to the surface. Sometimes, late at night, staring at the ceiling of the small room he shared with Daniel, he'd wonder if his father's way was truly strength, or just surrender. Was enduring this silently making him stronger, or just marking him as prey? It was during one particularly nasty cafeteria episode, Jake leaning over Ethan's table, mockingly inspecting his food while Mark and Sean flanked him like gargoyles, that Ethan first really noticed her. Olivia Vance. He'd been aware of her before, of course. Hard to miss the cascade of fiery red hair often escaping a messy bun, or the thick-rimmed glasses perched on her nose. She was another ghost, usually found tucked away in corners, nose buried in a book or, more often, a large, battered sketchbook. But this time, as Jake droned on about whatever pathetic topic he'd chosen for Ethan's humiliation that day, Ethan saw Olivia across the room. She wasn't looking away like most people. She was watching. Intently. Her head was bent over her sketchbook, pencil flying across the page with fierce concentration. She wasn't staring directly at him, more like observing the whole ugly scene. Documenting it. Ethan ignored Jake, finished his lunch with robotic precision, and left, the usual heat rising in his cheeks despite his outward calm. Later that week, seeking refuge in the relative quiet of the school library during study hall, he saw her again. Olivia was hunched over her sketchbook at a table near the back, lost in her work. Curiosity, a rare impulse for him here, pulled him closer as he walked past, pretending to browse the shelves. He caught a glimpse of the page. It wasn't just doodles. It was the cafeteria scene. Rendered with startling, almost brutal honesty. There was Jake, captured in all his sneering arrogance. Mark and Sean, looking like bored thugs. And there, in the center, was him. Ethan. But not the weak, victimized figure he felt like. The sketch showed his stillness, yes, but imbued it with a quiet intensity, a coiled dignity that felt surprisingly accurate. And utterly unexpected. He must have lingered too long. Something interesting? Her voice, quiet but clear, startled him. She didn't look up immediately, still shading a detail on Jake's face. Ethan felt his face flush. Sorry. Didn't mean to stare. It's just really good. Lame. So lame. She finally looked up, pushing her glasses higher on her nose. Her eyes, a startling shade of green behind the lenses, assessed him coolly for a moment. Then, a tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. You're interesting to draw, she said simply. You don't react like everyone else. He wasn't sure if it was a compliment. I try not to. Me too, she murmured, her gaze drifting back to her drawing. Trying not to react, I mean. Doesn't always work. She tapped her pencil against the page. Scholarship kid? Ethan blinked, surprised by her directness. He just nodded. Figured, she said, shrugging slightly. Takes one to know one, I guess. We've got that doesn't belong here aura. She finally closed the sketchbook. Olivia Vance. Ethan Park. He found himself sliding into the chair opposite her, an unplanned, impulsive act. For the first time since arriving at Northwood, maybe even since arriving in Maple Creek, he didn't feel the immediate, crushing need to explain himself or apologize for his existence. They sat in silence for a moment, the quiet hum of the library a welcome buffer. Why didn't you hit him? Olivia asked suddenly, her green eyes fixed on him again. Back in the cafeteria. Jake. You looked like you wanted to. Ethan considered the question, the familiar internal conflict churning. His father's words echoed. Restraint. Peace. But Olivia's blunt question demanded an honest, albeit careful, answer. Some fights aren't worth the fallout, he said slowly. Doesn't mean you don't want to, though. A genuine smile lit her face this time. Tell me about it. Another moment of shared understanding passed between them, fragile but real. An unlikely alliance forged in the no-man's land of Northwood's social hierarchy. Maybe it was that shared moment, that flicker of connection, that made what happened the next day possible. Ethan was heading to his locker when Mark, predictably, accidentally stuck out a foot, sending Ethan stumbling. Before Jake or Sean could add their usual commentary, Olivia, who happened to be nearby talking to a teacher, suddenly dropped her entire armload of books with a loud clatter, papers scattering everywhere. Oh, shoot. Sorry, Mr. Harrison, I'm so clumsy. The commotion drew immediate attention, momentarily diverting the focus from Ethan. By the time Olivia had gathered her things, blushing furiously, or maybe pretending to, Mark had lost interest, Jake was scowling, and the moment had passed. Ethan caught Olivia's eye as she straightened up. She gave him the briefest, almost imperceptible nod before hurrying off. He nodded back, a small warmth spreading through his chest. Maybe he wasn't entirely alone in this place after all. But as he turned away, he saw Jake Miller watching Olivia's retreating back, then shifting his gaze to Ethan. The usual dismissive smirk was gone, replaced by a colder, more calculating expression. Their newfound, fragile connection hadn't gone unnoticed. And Ethan had a chilling premonition that this unlikely alliance might just attract a whole new, more dangerous kind of attention. For, that fragile connection forged in the quiet corners of Northwood High, the shared understanding between Ethan and Olivia, felt like finding a single match in a pitch-black room. A small, precious light. But Ethan knew, with a certainty that coiled uncomfortably in his gut, that lights attract attention. Especially the unwanted kind. Jake Miller's calculating gaze hadn't missed Olivia's subtle act of defiance in the hallway, hadn't missed the brief exchange between the two scholarship kids. And now, with the Maple Creek Community Center's annual student art exhibit looming, Olivia was practically vibrating with anxiety. "They'll hate it," she muttered to Ethan a few days before the opening, hunched over her sketchbook in the library, erasing a line with unnecessary force. "My stuff is weird. Not like the pretty landscapes everyone else does." She chewed on her lower lip. And what if he comes? Ethan knew exactly who he was. "Your art isn't weird, Olivia. It's honest." He searched for the right words, feeling clumsy. "It shows things people don't usually see." He thought of the sketch she'd done of him in the cafeteria, the way she'd captured something beneath the surface. And Jake, he's just noise. Ignore him. Easy to say, harder to do, he knew. But seeing the genuine fear in her eyes sparked something protective in him. "I'll be there. My brother Daniel and my Yama too." Olivia looked up, a flicker of surprise softening her worried expression. "Really? Your family?" "Yeah," Ethan confirmed, offering a small, tentative smile. "Daniel, he appreciates honesty too. He'll like your work." Opening night at the community center buzzed with the low-key energy of a small-town event. Fluorescent lights fought valiantly against the aging wood paneling, folding tables held plastic cups of punch and slightly stale cookies, and proud parents mingled with local art enthusiasts. Ethan felt a familiar knot of awkwardness tighten as he walked in with Daniel and his mother, but seeing Olivia standing nervously beside her displayed canvases, her fiery hair practically glowing under the harsh lights, grounded him. His mother, usually so reserved, gave Olivia a warm, encouraging smile that made something loosen in Ethan's own chest. It was good to see his Iyama smile like that. Really good. Olivia's section was tucked in a corner, but her work immediately stood out. Stark charcoal portraits dominated, capturing raw, unguarded moments. A tired-looking waitress slumped over a counter. An old man staring out a window, loneliness etched deep in his face. Olivia had a gift for peeling back the layers, revealing the hidden currents beneath seemingly ordinary surfaces. And then Ethan saw it, hanging slightly apart from the others, the portrait of him. Cafeteria still life, the small card beside it read. He stared at it, heat rising in his face. She hadn't just drawn him, she'd somehow captured the internal battle, the tightrope walk between simmering anger and forced calm, the quiet defiance he himself barely acknowledged. It wasn't flattering, not exactly, but it was true. Profoundly true. He felt exposed, yet strangely validated. Seen. "Wow," Daniel murmured, standing beside him, his usual sternness replaced by quiet admiration. "She's got talent, Ethan. Real talent." Even his mother nodded, her eyes lingering on the portrait with a mixture of pride and perhaps a mother's worry. Olivia approached them, twisting her hands together. "So, what do you think?" she whispered, her gaze darting nervously around the room. "It's incredible, Olivia," Ethan said sincerely, meeting her eyes. "Especially that one." He nodded towards his portrait. A faint blush crept up her neck. "I just drew what I saw." The warmth of the moment, the small pocket of connection and validation, felt almost normal. A dangerous feeling at Northwood. And like clockwork, the danger arrived. The doors to the community center swung open with unnecessary force, and in swaggered Jake Miller, flanked by Mark and Sean. They looked absurdly out of place in their expensive jackets and bored, mocking expressions, scanning the room like predators searching for weakness. Their eyes landed on Olivia's display, and they sauntered over, a wave of unease rippling through the nearby crowd. Well, Jake drawled, loud enough for everyone to hear, stopping directly in front of Ethan's portrait. "Look what we have here. Little Nicky trying to look tough?" He snorted, turning to Olivia. "Seriously, Vance? This is your big masterpiece? A drawing of him?" Mark chimed in, peering closely at another portrait.
Man, this stuff is depressing. Doesn't anyone smile in your world?
Maybe she only hangs out with miserable charity cases, Sean added, nudging Mark, both chuckling. Olivia flinched as if struck, her face pale, eyes wide with humiliation and hurt. Ethan felt that familiar hot surge, the one he usually battled down, but this time it felt different. Sharper.
Angrier. This wasn't about him anymore.
They were deliberately hurting Olivia, using her art, her vulnerability, as a weapon against him. He took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists at his sides without conscious thought. But before he could speak, before the carefully constructed dam of his control could break, Daniel moved. Smoothly, silently, he was just there.
Standing beside Ethan, slightly in front. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make a threat. He simply met Jake's gaze with a calm, unwavering intensity that seemed to suck the air out of the immediate vicinity.
"This is a community art exhibition," Daniel said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable weight of authority.
Steel wrapped in velvet. You're disrupting it. Show the artists, and everyone else here, some basic respect. Or you can leave.
There was a beat of silence. Jake, Mark, and Sean, clearly thrown off by Daniel's unexpected presence and his utter lack of intimidation, exchanged uneasy glances. They weren't used to this kind of quiet, immovable strength. It wasn't loud or aggressive, but it was undeniably powerful. Jake visibly bristled, his ego pricked, but something in Daniel's eyes, a promise of absolute competence, perhaps, made him hesitate.
Whatever, Jake finally scoffed, trying to regain control, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. This place is lame anyway.
He shot a venomous look first at Daniel, then locked eyes with Ethan. The mockery was gone, replaced by cold, hard malice. "Don't think this changes anything, Park," he hissed, his voice low and menacing.
"This isn't over. Not by a long shot."
And then they were gone, leaving a thick, ugly silence in their wake.
Olivia looked like she was about to cry.
Several people nearby were studiously avoiding looking their way. The earlier warmth of the evening had completely evaporated, replaced by a chilling tension. Ethan looked at Olivia's distressed face, then at the portrait she'd drawn of him, the portrait Jake had used to wound her. A cold rage, different from the hot frustration he usually felt, settled deep inside him.
This was different.
Jake hadn't just insulted him, he'd targeted someone Ethan cared about, weaponizing her talent, her vulnerability.
He'd crossed a line.
Walking Olivia home later through the quiet Maple Creek streets, under the pale glow of the streetlights, the earlier triumph felt hollow. She tried to smile, tried to brush it off, but Ethan saw the fear still lingering in her eyes, the tremor in her hands as she clutched her sketchbook.
Jake's threat echoed in the space between them. This isn't over.
No, Ethan thought grimly, it wasn't.
Passive resistance, quiet endurance, maybe that wasn't enough anymore. Not when they started coming after the people you cared about.
A grim certainty settled over him, something worse was coming, and simply absorbing the blows wouldn't protect anyone. That walk home from the community center felt different. The quiet streets of Maple Creek, usually comforting in their predictability, now seemed to hold shadows in every corner.
Jake Miller's parting words, "This isn't over."
"Not by a long shot," echoed in Ethan's mind, cold and sharp. The line had been crossed. Olivia had been threatened, targeted because of him, because she dared to see something in him, because Daniel dared to stand up to them. His father's lessons on patience felt thin, worn, inadequate against this deliberate malice. The grim certainty that Jake would retaliate, find some way to assert his dominance, settled deep in Ethan's bones. It wasn't a matter of if, but when.
And how.
The following days at Northwood High were cloaked in an unnerving quiet. It was worse, somehow, than the constant barrage of whispers and shoves. Jake, Mark, and Sean were still there, occupying their usual space at the top of the food chain, but the overt hostility directed at Ethan ceased. Instead, there were lingering glances across classrooms, whispers that abruptly stopped when he drew near, a certain coiled energy in their posture whenever he passed. It felt like the eerie calm before a storm, the air thick with unspoken threats. Ethan found himself constantly scanning his surroundings, his senses dialed up to an exhausting level of alertness. He ate lunch quickly in the library, avoiding the cafeteria entirely, tried to make himself even smaller, more invisible, but the feeling of being watched, of waiting for the other shoe to drop, was relentless. The stress gnawed at him, tightening the muscles in his shoulders, stealing his already fractured sleep. He was at his locker late Tuesday afternoon, shoving books into his backpack, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the school and head to the dojo,
the only place he felt he could truly breathe, when it happened. A small, folded piece of paper fluttered out from the locker's vents as he slammed the metal door shut. He frowned, picking it up. Probably trash someone had shoved in there. But the writing, scrawled in thick black marker, made his blood run cold. Olivia needs help. Back parking lot. Now. His heart gave a painful jolt. Olivia. Now. Every protective instinct roared to life, momentarily silencing the immediate, blaring alarm bells in his head. Trap. The thought surfaced, cold and logical. Why a note? Why the back parking lot, deserted after school? Why would Olivia be there? She always took the bus from the front entrance. It reeked of a setup. Jake's clumsy, brutal signature was all over it. He fumbled for his phone, fingers clumsy. Dialed Olivia's number. No signal. Of course. The back of the school was a notorious dead zone. He cursed under his breath. What if it wasn't a trap? What if Jake, or Mark, or Sean, had cornered her back there? What if she was actually hurt, waiting, thinking he wouldn't come? The image, Olivia, scared, alone, was unbearable. He couldn't risk it. Couldn't live with himself if she was in trouble and he did nothing because he suspected a trap. His father's voice whispered about avoiding unnecessary conflict, but another, fiercer instinct took over. The one that had surfaced at the art show. Protect. His gut still screamed ambush, but his feet were already moving, carrying him through the increasingly empty hallways towards the rear exit. The air outside was heavy, humid, the sky bruised with dark, swollen clouds threatening a downpour. A cold wind whipped around the corners of the building, rattling the chain-link fence surrounding the deserted practice fields. Leaves skittered across the cracked asphalt of the back parking lot. It was a desolate, forgotten corner of the campus, smelling faintly of diesel fumes and overflowing dumpsters. And it was empty. Utterly empty. No sign of Olivia. Anywhere. A wave of dread washed over him, cold and sickening. He knew. He knew it was a trap. Fool. He turned, ready to bolt back towards the school, towards safety, towards anywhere but here. And there they were. Jake Miller emerged from behind a dented minivan, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. Mark materialized from the shadows by the dumpsters, cracking his knuckles. Sean stepped out from the corner of the building, effectively blocking the path back to the doors. They were positioned deliberately, forming a loose triangle, cutting off his escape. The air crackled, charged with malice. Looking for someone, Park? Jake asked, his voice dripping with false innocence. He took a step closer, Mark and Sean fanning out slightly. Heard your little girlfriend might be in trouble. Thought you'd come running. Ethan stood his ground, forcing himself to remain outwardly calm, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. He scanned their faces, their stances. Assessed the distance. Years of training kicked in, analyzing angles, calculating reaction times. Where is she, Jake? His voice was quiet, level, betraying none of the turmoil inside. Jake laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Worried about little Miss Scribbles? Touching. He stepped closer again, invading Ethan's space. The smirk turned into a sneer. You know, Park, I don't like people who think they're better than me. Coming here on your fancy scholarship, acting all quiet and respectful, like you're judging us. Like we owe you something. I don't think I'm better than anyone, Ethan said, keeping his gaze steady. I just want to be left alone. Too late for that, Mark grunted, shifting his weight. Yeah, Sean added, his eyes narrowed. You and your little artist friend, making fools of us at the art show with your brother stepping in. Think you can just disrespect us? Disrespect? Ethan almost choked. They crashed her show, insulted her art. But logic had no place here. This wasn't about reason. It was about power, about ego, about Jake needing to reassert his dominance after being momentarily checked by Daniel. It was about punishing Ethan for daring to exist, for daring to have a connection, for daring to possess a quiet dignity Jake couldn't understand or tolerate. I'm leaving, Ethan stated, trying one last time. He made to step around Jake. Jake didn't move. Instead, Mark shifted, blocking his path with a solid shoulder shove that rocked Ethan back on his heels. Didn't hear you say you could go, Mark growled. Ethan regained his balance instantly, the years of Taekwondo ensuring his footing was sure even on the uneven asphalt. He didn't retaliate. Not yet. But the air was electric now.
The point of no return rushed towards him like an oncoming train. The time for words, for restraint, for his father's philosophy, was over.
The first drop of rain, cold and fat, splattered on the pavement between them. Then another. The storm was breaking.
Mark, taking Ethan's lack of reaction as weakness, grinned and lunged forward, throwing a wild, clumsy punch aimed at Ethan's head.
Mark's wild punch flew, telegraphed by the rage contorting his face.
For Ethan, caught in the sudden violence after weeks of simmering tension, the world seemed to simultaneously speed up and slow down. The slap of rain on the asphalt, the grunts of effort, Jake's sharp intake of breath, it all registered with crystalline clarity, yet moved with the detached precision of a training drill. The parking lot dissolved, replaced in his mind's eye by the familiar blue mats of the Phoenix Academy. Instinct, honed over countless hours under Daniel's watchful eye and rooted in their father's teachings, took over.
He didn't meet Mark's sloppy haymaker with brute force. There was no need.
A slight pivot, a subtle shift of weight onto his back foot, and his left forearm intercepted Mark's wrist, not just blocking but redirecting the force outwards. Mark stumbled, his own momentum carrying him off balance. Before Mark could recover, Ethan flowed with the movement, his right hand securing a grip on Mark's elbow while his left maintained control of the wrist. A quick, controlled twist, a basic wrist lock, practiced 1,000 times, elicited a surprised yelp of pain. Ethan applied just enough pressure, leveraging Mark's joint against itself, forcing him down to one knee on the wet, gritty asphalt.
Minimal force. Maximum efficiency. He released the lock instantly as Mark collapsed, clutching his arm. One down.
Sean, seeing his friend neutralized so easily, let out an inarticulate roar and charged, head down like a bull seeing red.
He aimed low, trying to tackle Ethan around the waist. Bad move.
Ethan sidestepped Sean's clumsy rush, his movement fluid as water. As Sean barreled past, Ethan used the blade of his right hand in a precise, chopping strike to the back of Sean's knee, not hard enough to cause lasting damage, but sharp enough to buckle the joint. Sean cried out, his legs tangling beneath him, and sprawled face first onto the ground with a heavy thud, the wind knocked out of him.
2 down. It had taken maybe 5 seconds.
Silence hung heavy for a heartbeat, broken only by the increasing tempo of the rain and Sean's ragged gasps. Jake Miller stood frozen for that fraction of a second, disbelief warring with fury on his face. His two cronies, dispatched with almost contemptuous ease. By the quiet scholarship kid. The loser. The disbelief vanished, consumed by pure, unadulterated rage.
You little freak! Jake snarled, finally moving.
He was bigger than Mark or Sean, maybe stronger, definitely fueled by a potent cocktail of wounded pride and raw anger now. He didn't charge wildly like Sean, he advanced with a boxer's shuffle, fists raised, circling Ethan warily. There was a crude power in his movements, less technique, more aggression. He feinted left, then threw a hard right cross aimed at Ethan's jaw. Ethan blocked it, the impact jarring his arm despite the clean technique. Jake followed immediately with a left hook. Ethan slipped inside the punch, the blow whistling past his ear. He could feel the heat radiating off Jake, smell the faint, acrid scent of pure fury. This was different. Jake was faster, stronger, and driven by something uglier than Mark and Sean's follow-the-leader mentality. Ethan blocked another jab, then a clumsy attempt at a kick. He was purely on the defensive, his footwork keeping him just out of range, his blocks sharp and economical. Defense. Evade. Control. Do not attack. His father's principles were a mantra in his head, a lifeline in the storm of Jake's assault. But defending was harder now. Jake's punches landed with heavy, bruising force on his forearms. Fight back, you coward. Jake spat, lunging again, trying to grab Ethan's dobok jacket. Ethan pivoted away, breaking the grip before it could fully form. He saw the opening then. Jake, frustrated and overextended from the lunge, left his chin exposed for a split second. The instinct, the training, presented the target. A quick, snapping front kick. A clean, sharp strike to the jaw. Enough to stun, to stop the attack. It was there for the taking. He could end this. Right now. But the image of his father's face, the memory of Daniel's words, "They don't deserve to know who you are," held him back. No. Not like that. That wasn't the way. Instead, as Jake recovered his balance, Ethan moved with blinding speed. Not an attack, but a counter rooted in defense. He stepped inside Jake's next wild swing, using an open-handed palm block to deflect the punch upwards. Simultaneously, his other hand shot out, fingers stiffened, striking Jake precisely in the solar plexus. Not a full-force blow, but a sharp, perfectly placed jolt designed to expel air, to incapacitate without causing real injury. The effect was instantaneous. Jake let out a huge whoosh of breath, his eyes widening in shock and pain. He doubled over, clutching his stomach, gasping desperately for air that wouldn't come. He stumbled back a few steps, then sank to his knees on the wet pavement, unable to stand, unable to speak, the fight completely knocked out of him. It was over. Just like that. Less than 15 seconds, probably. Ethan stood in the center of the triangle, his breathing only slightly quickened, his stance balanced. Rain plastered his hair to his forehead, dripped from his chin. Around him, his three assailants were incapacitated. Mark nursing his wrist, Sean still catching his breath, Jake kneeling, gasping like a landed fish. There was no triumph on Ethan's face. No anger. Just a profound, weary calm, the adrenaline beginning its slow retreat, leaving behind the hollow ache of a conflict he never wanted. He had defended himself. He had adhered to his principles. Minimal force. Control. But looking at the three figures on the ground, a wave of something akin to sadness washed over him. Was this victory? It didn't feel like it. He took a deep, steadying breath, the cool rain on his face a welcome sensation. The world seemed quiet for a moment, just the drumming of the rain on the asphalt and the ragged breathing of the defeated bullies. He needed to leave. Now. But before the thought could even fully form, the sound cut through the rain. Shouts. Running footsteps echoing from the direction of the school building. Ethan's head snapped up, his weary calm instantly replaced by a new, sharper wave of dread. Figures were emerging from the rear exit, running towards the parking lot. Teachers? Security? The context of the fight shifted in a terrifying instant. This wasn't the dojo. This wasn't about self-defense anymore. This was Northwood High. And the consequences were just beginning. The shouts cut through the rhythm of the falling rain, sharp and authoritative. Ethan looked up from the scene of quiet devastation around him, Mark groaning, Sean still gasping, Jake kneeling in stunned, winded silence, to see Principal Thompson and Vice Principal Evans hurrying across the glistening asphalt towards them, their faces grim masks of displeasure. The shift was instantaneous, sickening. The raw survival instinct of the fight evaporated, replaced by the cold dread of institutional consequences. This wasn't the dojo anymore. There were different rules here. Rules Ethan suspected were not designed in his favor. Before the administrators even reached them, Jake Miller, displaying a miraculous recovery, scrambled to his feet, pointing a shaking, accusatory finger at Ethan. Principal Thompson. He attacked us. Just went nuts. Jake cried, his voice laced with practiced victimhood. We saw him looking upset, came over to see if he was okay, and he just snapped. Started throwing kicks, like some kind of crazed animal. Mark and Sean, catching their cues, chimed in with pathetic groans, clutching imaginary injuries. It was a performance, clumsy yet effective in its immediate, noisy accusation. Ethan simply stood still, rain dripping from his hair, his breathing evening out, his dobok soaked through. He met Principal Thompson's stern gaze, saying nothing, waiting. The contrast was stark, the composed, rain-slicked boy standing calmly amidst the wreckage, and the three supposedly injured victims already spinning their tail. My office. All of you. Now, Principal Thompson commanded, her voice tight with anger. The principal's office felt cold and sterile after the raw energy of the parking lot. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, reflecting off the polished surface of the large oak desk. Ethan sat straight in the uncomfortable visitor chair, hands clasped loosely in his lap, focusing on keeping his breathing slow and even, just as Daniel had taught him. Across the desk, Jake, Mark, and Sean slumped in their chairs, already launched into a frantic, overlapping narrative of Ethan's supposed unprovoked assault. They gestured wildly, interrupted each other, their voices tinged with indignant outrage that felt utterly false to Ethan. Vice Principal Evans stood near the window, arms crossed, observing the scene with an unervingly neutral expression, while Principal Thompson sat behind her desk, her face a thundercloud. Finally, she silenced the trio with a sharp wave of her hand and turned her formidable gaze on Ethan. Mr. Park, she began, her tone clipped and severe. Northwood High has a zero-tolerance policy regarding violence. Fighting is grounds for immediate suspension, potentially expulsion. You understand this, correct? Especially given the conditions of your scholarship? Ethan felt a chill despite the stuffy office air.
The scholarship.
The unspoken weight, the invisible chain. Yes, Principal Thompson, he answered, his voice quiet but steady. Then perhaps you can explain, she continued, leaning forward slightly, why 3 of your fellow students allege you attacked them without any provocation whatsoever. It wasn't an attack, ma'am, Ethan stated calmly, meeting her gaze directly.
It was self-defense. They ambushed me in the back parking lot.
They sent a fake note saying my friend was in trouble.
Liar. Jake exploded, slamming his hand on the armrest of his chair.
Mark and Sean muttered agreement.
He's making it up.
We were just cutting through the lot.
He came at us. Ask anyone. Better yet, check the security cameras. They'll show you exactly what happened. Jake finished triumphantly, a smug look flickering across his face. He knew something Ethan didn't.
Principal Thompson looked towards Vice Principal Evans, who cleared his throat. Unfortunately, Mr. Evans said, his eyes briefly meeting Ethan's with something that might have been regret, the camera covering the northwest corner of the back lot malfunctioned 2 days ago.
We're waiting on a repair technician. A coincidence? Ethan didn't think so.
Cold dread washed over him. The location, the lack of witnesses, the broken camera, it was all deliberate. A perfectly constructed trap, and he'd walked right into it. His word against 3 of theirs.
And Jake Miller's word carried weight in Maple Creek.
Principal Thompson sighed, steepling her fingers. Mr. Park, without corroborating evidence or witnesses, I am faced with 3 injured students and your claim of self-defense. School policy in such situations is clear, her voice trailed off, but the implication hung heavy in the air.
Suspension. Investigation. And the scholarship? It would be revoked.
Everything his family had sacrificed, gone. Because of Jake Miller's lies. Despair threatened to swallow him whole. Just as the principal opened her mouth to deliver the verdict, there was a soft, hesitant knock on the office door.
Everyone turned.
Mr. Evans opened it to reveal Olivia Vance, standing there looking small and drenched, her sketchbook clutched to her chest like a shield. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, but there was a spark of determination in them that Ethan hadn't seen before.
Ms. Vance?
Principal Thompson sounded surprised.
What is it? Jake shot Olivia a look dripping with menace. What are you doing here, Vance? This doesn't concern you.
Olivia ignored him, stepping fully into the office, her gaze fixed on the principal. Excuse me, Principal Thompson, she began, her voice trembling slightly but clear. But it does concern me.
I saw what happened.
A stunned silence filled the room. Ethan stared at her, a mixture of shock, gratitude, and sudden, sharp fear for her washing over him.
What was she doing? Didn't she realize the risk?
You saw, the principal prompted, leaning forward again.
Yes, ma'am.
Olivia took a deep breath. I saw Ethan get the note from his locker.
I had a weird feeling about it.
I saw him head towards the back lot, and I followed, from a distance. I was behind the gym. Her voice grew stronger, more confident. I saw them, she gestured towards Jake, Mark, and Sean, waiting for him. They surrounded him.
He tried to leave. Mark shoved him.
Then Mark threw the first punch.
Ethan was defending himself. They attacked him.
She delivered the words clearly, factually, her gaze unwavering now, though her knuckles were white where she gripped her sketchbook. Jake sputtered, she's lying.
She's his friend. She wasn't even there.
I was there, Olivia repeated firmly, finally shifting her gaze to meet Jake's glare head-on. The fear was still there, but beneath it was courage. Raw, unexpected courage.
I saw everything. Principal Thompson looked from Olivia's determined face to Jake's furious one, then to Ethan's stunned silence.
The carefully constructed narrative of the bullies had crumbled. Doubt, clear and undeniable, entered the principal's eyes. She knew Olivia Vance, a quiet, studious girl, another scholarship student unlikely to lie for someone unless it was the truth. And she knew Jake Miller, and the reputation that preceded him. She held up a hand, silencing Jake's renewed protests.
Thank you, Ms. Vance.
That took courage. She looked back at Ethan, then at the 3 boys. Her expression was hard to read.
All right, she said finally. Given this conflicting testimony, the mandatory suspension for Mr. Park is rescinded. Pending a full investigation into this entire incident.
She fixed Jake, Mark, and Sean with a stern look. And rest assured, instigating conflict and making false accusations carry their own serious consequences.
We will get to the bottom of this.
Ethan felt a wave of dizzying relief, so potent it almost buckled his knees.
Not expelled. Not suspended. Scholarship intact. For now.
But as he and Olivia were dismissed, walking out of the office into the now empty hallway, the relief was already mingling with a heavy unease. They exchanged a look, a silent acknowledgement of the bullet dodged, the risk Olivia had taken, and the certain knowledge that this was far from over.
Jake Miller, backed by his family's influence, wouldn't let this go.
They had won this round, maybe. But leaving the office, into the quiet tension of the school, felt less like a victory and more like stepping into the uncertain, dangerous calm before the real storm hit.
The fallout was coming, they both knew it.
That shared look between Ethan and Olivia outside Principal Thompson's office held a universe of unspoken understanding, relief, certainly, but tangled with the sharp awareness of a battle only temporarily paused.
They'd won a reprieve, shielded by Olivia's unexpected, raw courage. But the angry disbelief in Jake Miller's eyes as he'd been escorted out was a promise. The fallout, Ethan knew, wouldn't be long in coming.
And it wouldn't be aimed at him, not directly.
Not anymore.
Jake wasn't stupid, he understood consequences, especially when administrators were watching. No, the retaliation would be insidious, cowardly. And it would target the person whose bravery had cost him face, Olivia. It started subtly, a campaign of whispers and psychological warfare. Olivia would find her locker jammed. Texts meant for group projects would mysteriously fail to reach her. But the real escalation came about a week later. She found her treasured sketchbook, the one Ethan had seen her pour her heart into, left open on her art class stool. A thick slash of black paint marred the cover. Inside, several pages were ripped, crumpled. The stunning charcoal portrait of Ethan from the cafeteria incident had been viciously defaced, crude lines scratched over his face, angry slashes obscuring the quiet dignity she'd captured. Tucked between the violated pages was a single sheet of plain white paper. On it, words crudely cut from magazines and pasted unevenly, TRAITORS.
TAY. WATCH. YOUR. BACK.
Ethan found her huddled in a corner of the library during lunch period, not sketching, just staring blankly at the wall, the damaged sketchbook clutched tightly in her lap. Her usual fiery spirit seemed extinguished, replaced by a brittle fear. He'd noticed her avoiding him for the past couple of days, her smiles forced, her eyes skittish.
Now he knew why.
"Olivia," he asked softly, sliding into the chair beside her. She jumped, startled.
What happened?
She hesitated, then reluctantly pushed the sketchbook towards him. Ethan's breath hitched as he saw the ripped pages, the defaced portrait, the ugly, anonymous threat. A cold rage, colder and harder than anything he'd felt in the parking lot, settled in his chest. This was Jake's doing.
His cowardice.
Attacking her art, her voice, because he couldn't face Ethan directly anymore. Guilt washed over him, she was suffering this because she'd stood up for him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, his voice tight. Olivia finally looked at him, her green eyes swimming with unshed tears, but also a spark of defiance.
"I didn't want to burden you. It's my fight, I guess."
She tried for a shaky smile.
"Besides, what could you do?
"It's just stupid stuff."
"It's not stupid stuff, Olivia," Ethan said firmly. "It's intimidation. It's meant to silence you. We can't let them."
He thought for a moment, the atmosphere of the dojo, its sense of discipline and strength, rising in his mind.
An idea formed, sudden and clear. "Come with me," he said. "After school. To the Phoenix Academy. My brother's dojo." Olivia looked bewildered. "The Taekwondo place? Why?"
"Because," Ethan said, meeting her gaze steadily, "this isn't just about fighting them physically. It's about not letting them make you feel small. Or scared.
Daniel, he can teach you things. How to stand your ground. How to feel safer. Stronger.
Not just in your body, but here."
He tapped his temple gently. "It's more than just kicking and punching." She looked hesitant, glancing down at her paint-stained fingers. "Me? Taekwondo?" "Ethan, I trip walking down the hallway." "Everyone starts somewhere," Ethan insisted gently. "Just, come see. Please." Her first visit to the Phoenix Academy was tentative. She hovered near the entrance, watching Ethan and Daniel move through drills with a power and grace that seemed utterly alien. The sharp commands, the focused intensity, it was a world away from her quiet corners and sketchbooks. Daniel greeted her with a formal bow and a brief, assessing look, but Ethan saw the flicker of respect in his brother's eyes. He'd clearly told Daniel what Olivia had done. Hesitantly, Olivia stepped onto the mats, feeling clumsy and conspicuous in her borrowed, oversized sweatpants. Her first attempts at basic stances felt awkward, her blocks flimsy. But Daniel was patient, his instructions clear and concise, focusing on balance, breath, awareness. Ethan worked with her sometimes, correcting her posture with quiet encouragement, their earlier library connection finding a new, unexpected expression here amidst the controlled energy of the dojo. Slowly, tentatively, something began to shift within Olivia. It wasn't just about learning to block a punch, it was about finding her center, about the surprising empowerment that came from controlling her own body, her own breath, channeling her frustration into focus. A quiet confidence started to bloom, replacing some of the fear. And they weren't the only ones finding something they needed at the Phoenix Academy. News travels fast in a place like Northwood High. Whispers about the parking lot fight, about Olivia's stand in the principal's office, about the quiet Korean kid who wasn't such an easy target after all, had circulated. Soon, other students started appearing at the dojo's slightly battered door. Kids Ethan recognized from the periphery of school life, other scholarship students, shy kids who usually ate lunch alone, kids who'd borne the brunt of smaller, less dramatic bullying for years. They came quietly, hesitantly at first. Some just sat on the worn benches lining the wall, watching, absorbing the atmosphere of quiet respect and discipline. Others, emboldened perhaps by Olivia's presence, shyly asked Daniel about joining a class. The dojo began to transform. It was still the place where Ethan and Daniel honored their father's legacy, but it also became something more, an unlikely sanctuary, a hub for the quiet, the overlooked, the ones who didn't fit neatly into Northwood's rigid hierarchy. A community forged not from shared popularity, but from shared experience, from a quiet refusal to be invisible or intimidated any longer. This subtle shift began to ripple back into the school itself. Jake, Mark, and Sean returned from their brief suspension. The rumors varied on the exact punishment, but Ethan knew Jake's family influence likely softened the blow, expecting things to return to normal. But they didn't. The fear they usually inspired had lessened, replaced by something harder to define, a quiet solidarity among the students they usually targeted. When Jake tried his usual swagger down the main hall, kids didn't automatically shrink away. When Mark tried to accidentally knock books from a smaller kid's hands near Ethan and Olivia's lockers, several other students, faces Ethan now recognized from the dojo, simply stepped closer, forming a silent, watchful barrier until Mark backed off, scowling. Ethan saw Jake watching them sometimes, him and Olivia walking together, talking easily, occasionally joined by another dojo regular. They weren't hiding. They weren't afraid. And Jake's usual tools, intimidation, mockery, exclusion, seemed less effective against this quiet, growing network. The power dynamic, built on fear and privilege, was subtly, undeniably shifting. Ethan caught the flicker of frustration in Jake's eyes, the dawning realization that his control was slipping. One afternoon, watching Olivia execute a surprisingly sharp block during practice, a real smile touched Ethan's lips. The dojo was filled with the rhythmic sounds of training, a quiet energy of shared purpose. Daniel nodded in approval from across the room. Other students moved through their forms with newfound focus. It wasn't perfect. The threats hadn't vanished entirely, and the tensions at Northwood still simmered beneath the surface. But looking around the room, at the community taking shape within these humble walls, Ethan felt a burgeoning sense of hope. This felt right. This felt like real strength. Not just enduring alone, but building something together. The path forward was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like a path they were forging themselves, together. That quiet energy humming within the Phoenix Taekwondo Academy wasn't just contained within its sweat-scented walls anymore. It had begun to seep out, carried in the newfound confidence of students like Olivia, reflected in the growing solidarity among those who had once felt isolated at Northwood High. The ripples spread, slowly, subtly, but undeniably changing the currents of the school. It wasn't an overnight revolution, no dramatic overthrow of the established order. It was quieter than that. More persistent. Like water wearing away stone. Fast forward a year. Graduation day at Northwood High. The air buzzed with a different kind of energy now, excitement, relief, the bittersweet tang of endings and beginnings. Caps and gowns replaced hoodies and worn sneakers. Ethan Park stood among his classmates, waiting for his name to be called. He wasn't hiding at the back anymore. He wasn't seeking invisibility. He stood tall, not with arrogance, but with a quiet self-possession that felt earned, settled deep within him. When his name was announced, Ethan Park, high honors, a warm wave of applause rippled through the section where Daniel and his mother sat, his Iyama's face beaming with a pride that made Ethan's heart ache in the best possible way. He walked across the stage, accepted his diploma from Principal Thompson, and met her eyes with a respectful nod. He wasn't the same boy who had stood terrified in her office a year ago. Neither, perhaps, was she the same principal. Later, amidst the chaos of congratulations and tearful goodbyes on the sun-drenched lawn, he found Olivia. Her fiery red hair was slightly tamed under her mortarboard, her green eyes bright behind her familiar glasses. She held her own diploma and a small, leather-bound sketchbook, a graduation gift from him. They didn't need many words. A shared smile conveyed everything: the journey they'd taken, the battles fought side by side, the bond forged in adversity and strengthened in the quiet sanctuary of the dojo. They were partners now, in every sense that mattered. Evenings often found them side by side on the mats at the Phoenix Academy, co-teaching the burgeoning youth class, passing on the lessons of discipline, respect, and finding your voice to kids whose nervous energy reminded Ethan so much of himself not so long ago. The dojo itself was thriving. No longer just the Park brothers' struggle, it had become a true community center. Daniel, though still the dedicated subordinate, seemed lighter, the heavy burden of sole responsibility eased by the shared energy, by Ethan's growing leadership, by Olivia's quiet organizational skills, and by the influx of students who found more than just martial arts training there. They found acceptance. They found empowerment. They found a place where strength wasn't measured by aggression or status, but by integrity, resilience, and the willingness to support one another. It turned out Ethan's father had been right, though perhaps not in the way Ethan had initially understood. True strength wasn't loud. It was the quiet solidarity of the dojo community. It was Olivia facing down her fear to speak the truth. It was Daniel's unwavering calm in the face of provocation. It was learning when to stand firm and when to simply breathe. Looking back, the memories of those first brutal weeks at Northwood felt both distant and incredibly vivid. The loneliness, the constant low-level fear, the sting of the insults, the terrifying confrontation in the parking lot. It had been a trial by fire. But fire hardened steel. It hadn't just been about surviving, it had been about learning, growing, transforming. He understood now that the black belt tied around his waist was just a symbol. The real Taekwondo, the real strength, was lived off the mat. It was in choosing control over chaos, defense over attack, integrity over expediency. It was in protecting others, not just himself. It was in building bridges, not walls. It was about realizing that sometimes, the most powerful thing you could do is help someone else find their strength. Across the crowded graduation lawn, Ethan caught a glimpse of Jake Miller. He was surrounded by a couple of guys, but the swagger seemed forced now, the orbit smaller. Jake hadn't suddenly become a better person, Ethan harbored no illusions about that. But his power, the kind built on fear and intimidation, had clearly diminished within the school walls. When Jake's eyes briefly met Ethan's, there was no challenge there, just a flicker of something unreadable, resentment, perhaps? Before Jake looked away, turning back to his dwindling circle. It wasn't triumph Ethan felt, just a quiet confirmation. Some victories aren't about crushing the opponent, they're about rendering their power irrelevant. Olivia bumped his shoulder gently, pulling him from his thoughts. Ready to face the real world, she asked, a teasing glint in her eyes. Ethan looked at her, then around at the bustling scene, at Daniel and his mother waving from nearby, at the familiar facade of Northwood High that no longer felt quite so alien or hostile. He thought of the Phoenix Academy, waiting for its evening classes, filled with kids learning more than just kicks and punches. Maple Creek hadn't magically become paradise. Life would still hold challenges. But he wasn't facing them alone anymore. And he wasn't the same invisible boy who arrived wishing only to disappear. Yeah, he said, a genuine smile reaching his eyes. I think I am. He had found his place, not by blending in, but by standing firm, by finding his voice, and by helping to weave a new beginning, not just for himself, but for the community they had built together, thread by quiet, resilient thread. True strength, he finally understood, wasn't about facing the world alone, but about changing it, just enough, so that others didn't have to.